So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our second panel of the day, focusing on inclusive workplaces in a post-pandemic era, with some great discussion planned on hybrid and flexible workplaces that have been especially a hot topic through the pandemic, and especially important when considering the support of women in the workforce. The panel will be moderated by Mark Agnew, Senior Vice President of Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And our panelists will include Emily Brine, who is the Managing Director of Firma Operations, Talent and Culture, Office of the CEO, and Senior Partner at KPMG. Jody Drake, who is the Director of Talent Management at Suncor. Becca Mintz, the Vice President, Head of Customer Acquisitions at Capital One. And Kiersten Mohr, Founder of Terra Firma Transition Consulting. Welcome all to this great conversation. And Mark, the floor is over to you.
That's great. Well, thanks, Jenna, for that introduction. And, I really do want to pick up on the point that you made about listen and learn. When I think about, what does the post-pandemic workplace look like, it's a challenge that every single member of ours is struggling with, right? From the multinational companies through down to the, small business that has 3 employees, thinking about how to grapple with the new environment, both from a public health standpoint, an employee expectation standpoint, and also a competition for talent standpoint, because companies are offering different things. And this does, certainly when we hear from our members, affect how they're able to attract and retain that critical talent. And also too, I think one of the benefits of this conversation, again, picking up on the theme of listening and learning, is that, as we're all trying to work through this, it's really important to see around the blind spots that we have as companies. As, organizations, we all have a certain way of doing things, a certain way that we think things should be done, but having these 4 very diverse perspectives from different parts of the economy, I hope is helping to unpack that a little bit more and help everyone collectively in the audience see around the blind spots and see as to what some of the challenges and opportunities are about how to think through these issues differently. And so with that, we're going to start with kind of a quick round of introductions with the panel, and then we'll get some questions. What I'll say to the audience, as folks will know that dialed in for the first panel, we do have Slido available with questions that audience members can submit, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can over the course of the conversation. So please do input those Slido questions as things come to mind. So maybe just to start off with some introductions of themselves and the organization, how about Emily? We can go to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, good morning, everyone. So my name is Emily Brine, and I'm the Manager Director of Firma Operations, Talent and Culture at KPMG in Canada. And for those who are unfamiliar with KPMG, it's a professional services firm that offers audit, tax, and advisory services across Canada, large array of clients, multiple industries, sectors. And yeah, we have employed over 10,000 employees right now. So we're a large organization. So that's a little bit about me. I'm not sure, Mark, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Kiersten, why don't we go to you next?
Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to everyone for having me. It's been a great morning so far and learning a ton. My name is Kiersten Mohr. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the founder and managing director of Terra Firma, and many of you might not know what Terra Firma does, but our organization's really focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion, and working with organizations to build really impactful and what I would call extinction-proof EDI strategies for the organizations, really customized to the organization and the challenges that you're facing. One focus area that we do have is around the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse employees and facilitating folks in that journey and just helping individuals get through that without leaving their jobs that they love, which is the common challenge. So that's a little bit about me, and very excited and happy to be here.
Great. Jody, why don't we go to you next?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Jody Drake, and I am the Director of Talent Management at Suncor Energy, part of the Talent and Culture team. Suncor is an integrated energy company looking to create a better future for the world, and you might know us through Petro-Canada gas stations or a number of different areas. And we're delighted to be part of this conversation as we are looking at our purpose and our culture and learning along the way. Thank you.
Great. And last but not least, Becca.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here with this group today. I'm Becca Mintz, and I'm a vice president at Capital One Canada, focused on acquiring new customers. Capital One is a financial services company. We're the 5th largest bank in the US. And in Canada, we're focused on helping Canadians succeed with credit, primarily through credit cards. I also have the pleasure of being a member of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's Council for Women's Advocacy. And I'm also on the Parents Advisory Council for St. Michael's Hospital's Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, which is actually where my son Theodore spent the early months of his life. I'm so excited to be here today with this esteemed group, and I'm looking forward to not only sharing, but doing some learning myself.
Great. Well, and thanks a lot, Becca, also for the shameless plug about the Chamber's Council for Women's Advocacy. That we didn't put you up to that, but thank you for plugging it nonetheless. So I think, it goes without saying that, the pandemic has had a massive change in the workplace, whether you're, going 100% remote, whether you're going for, hybrid, or whether even maybe you want to go back to the way it was pre-pandemic and have folks, come in the office 5 days a week and navigating through some of those tensions that you're seeing. And of course, this is a business event focused on women in business, and it's had a lot of implications as well, particularly for women in the workplace, particularly for those that have either childcare responsibilities or elder care responsibilities that do fall disproportionately to women. So maybe just start off, I'd be curious to hear a little bit about some opening thoughts, on the current state of things, and what are some of those challenges and opportunities. So maybe Kiersten, we can go to you first for this one.
Sure, thank you for that. I think that the pandemic, from the opportunity, if we start on that side of your question, I think it really forced this experiment that all of us were afraid to try, like with respect to remote work, and just would that work, and could we keep moving forward? I think the pandemic was, in many ways, a gift to prove to us that we can function in this world. So that part is a huge opportunity. The other thing that I really like to pull out of the opportunity side is a friend of mine said that the pandemic and going to this virtual, what we're doing today, this Zoom kind of work culture is it was an exercise of forced vulnerability, which I really liked. It really made us all really aware that we've got kids popping in, and we've got pets, and we're sitting in our own homes, and we're running late because we're answering the door. And so it just created a bit of comfort that all of that stuff can be happening, and we can still be quote unquote professional and productive and get the work done. So I think that's the opportunity. I think the challenge as we go back is not flipping back to comfortable. A big thing that I'll talk about, a lot of my comments today, you'll get sick of me saying, is I think that the path to change for all of us, or taking that next step with respect to equity inclusion, is really about the art of becoming comfortable being uncomfortable. Because I think that the future is going to look different, and we just have to be comfortable that different doesn't mean bad, it just means different. And there's opportunity in that. So I think as we go back and we're having all these debates and conversations about hybrid, and I think that we need to take that one step further and take the opportunity to look at where other opportunities and advantages are. My fear is that, with all the other challenges in the world, that we bounce back to what was comfortable and what worked in the past, and that just won't be the most opportunistic thing for the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point on, the bounce back into, human nature, right? Is we want to go to the path of, least resistance and what we know. But I think your point about different is just that it's different, doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. So maybe Jodi, we can go to you next.
Yeah, thank you. I really agree with you, Kiersten. I feel that we learned the same thing in the pandemic, that it was a great equalizer. We accelerated a lot of the work that we were thinking about, and proved the use case that flexibility is actually good for everyone. We all got connected to people outside of work, their whole person, and the opportunity to bring the whole person to work. And I think that resulted in more comfort and acceptance of and tolerance, that we all have lives, and we all are. It made it okay to say, I can't do this because of the kids or other commitments or anything like that. And I think that that's a great foundation for us to build from and really learn from. and as you say, it's vulnerability, and we all had to be vulnerable. And I think that sets us further and further ahead. So as we come back into, while a hybrid, Suncor is a workplace-centric or office environment for about half of our organizations. And I feel like we're really challenged to find that right balance again between presence and outcomes and learn from that. And we don't have enough data or experience. We're learning, we're testing, we're adapting. And we also do have the scenario where we're a field operator. We have people who have been at work the whole time. So how do we make sure that we're conscious of that narrative on return to office when more than half of our people really have been coming in and doing their job every day? And how do you create that inclusive environment and a great place for all? The other challenge that I'm starting to see is that our people are really tired, and we need a break. And while flexibility and working from home or working from elsewhere can help with that, I think we're all having to adjust to coming back to, call it, regular life. And how can we, especially for women who do take on that bigger load often, how do we support all of our employees, but especially women, through that adjustment?
Great. No, thanks for that, Jody. And I think certainly your point and experience in Suncor, right? I mean, you can't sort of, staff the oil operations from, your basement computer. You definitely ought to have someone there physically. So, a really interesting set of challenges that you've had to work through, with that sort of field workforce, and then of course your white collar in office workforce as well. Emily, we can go to you next.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we've talked about flexibility and we've talked about the opportunities that come with that, and sort of along the lines of the vulnerability, which we've heard about as well, as this notion of empathetic leadership, and I think that it's something that we don't necessarily hear that much about when we talk about the experience through COVID. But I do think that women have this a bit of an advantage when it comes to the empathy advantage and the opportunities that women had to establish themselves as leaders throughout the pandemic was really clear. Certainly in our experience it was. And they've taken that empathy and used it in critical team building, maintaining cohesive teams, and that is going to be really important as we go forward in a hybrid environment. And so I think that women will have a real advantage there, leveraging that skill set. Also that compassion that women have. I think that, with respect to reaching out to assess the mental well-being and personal and professional needs in times of challenge, I think that that's certainly been something that, again, comes with empathetic leadership that I think is an advantage that women have and that we should continue to leverage go forward. So I think that's a real opportunity for women in the future with respect to women in leadership.
Great, and I know we're going to come back to that empathy advantage in a piece that you wrote in a subsequent question. So hold that thought. Becca, over to you on this sort of one of the challenges and opportunities.
Sure. Well, starting with the challenges, I have a feeling I'm going to be more of a bummer than my fellow panelists here, but I'll bring it back to some optimism, I promise. As Jody mentioned, I think women have traditionally had that bigger role when it comes to taking on more of the caregiving responsibilities. And as we all know, during the pandemic, those responsibilities went up. We had children at home. For me, it meant eating at home a lot more than being able to be at restaurants or fast food places, et cetera. And unfortunately, that also disproportionately affected women. And we know this because 10 times more women exited the workforce during the pandemic than men. We also know that the types of jobs women are returning to aren't necessarily the same types of jobs that they vacated. There was a recent survey from the Prosperity Project, which has tons of great data in it, but it also included that fewer Canadian women are working full-time than prior to the pandemic. And that stat means that, we're not quite back to where we are, even if the high-level numbers may indicate we may be. There's more options now that many folks have mentioned, so flexible hours and working locations, but we also need to be mindful of who's going to be opting into that flexibility. And how might we proactively combat the inherent bias that may come along with people making different decisions along the way? That same survey that I referenced said that 63% of women would turn down a promotion at work if it meant they could keep working at home. And I do want to be clear that I don't think this is about what's right or wrong in terms of individual choices. There's great reasons to choose flexible work arrangements, whether it's spending time with your family, elder care, or even avoiding microaggressions in the workplace, which is something we've talked a lot about at Capital One with my peer group in terms of the impact of being at home versus being in the office. We know that women experience these microaggressions. I suspect if we split the data even further by women of color or members of our LGBTQ plus community, we would see it even more pronounced. So I think there's good reason for it, but I also believe there's going to be an impact and we have to have open conversations on it. Okay, I warned you I was going to be a bummer. I'll turn it around. I think there is a silver lining here, and I like the way Kiersten phrased the forced vulnerability. And I would add on to that by saying that I also think it shines a spotlight on these biases, and it enables us to have open conversations. I'm having way more conversations today with my peer group at Capital One on these topics, and it's fantastic to hear such open-mindedness and such problem solving around how we might proactively start solving for these biases, knowing that we're entering a totally different era of work than the one we came from pre-pandemic. A few actions that come to mind on my side: data collection. I work for a very data-driven company, so of course I would say data collection, but really understanding the numbers, seeing advancement rates and other outcomes that we believe are really important as a measure of whether or not there's bias in that system. And I can't more strongly recommend data collection within organizations. And then finally, really encouraging people to be their full authentic selves at work. And it's easy to say that, but there's a lot of things we can actively do to encourage it. A great example from Capital One is our Parents at Work network. It is a community of folks that come together to talk about the difficulties that they face as working parents, trade solutions, especially in the days where daycares were closed or schools were closed and people were looking for community, a sense of belonging, and pragmatic ideas to make the days a little bit easier. And it's even easier to connect now than it ever was before because there's Slack channels and Zooms. Look at this awesome event that we're all at today being conducted virtually. So there's so many opportunities for us all to come together as a group. So I see a number of challenges, but I really do see a lot of opportunities, and I'm excited to keep the conversation going this morning.
Great, thanks for that, Becca. And now we'll go back to Emily to kind of talk about a piece that she had published earlier this year, and then we'll be able to bring in the other three panelists as well on that. And so, Emily, you had a piece published around International Women's Day in March in the Globe and Mail, and you talked about kind of the shift around presenteeism. You talked about sort of the empathy advantage. And for those of you who haven't seen the piece, I thought it was quite notable for a media editorial in the sense of there were actually really specific recommendations that Emily had put in there around, what is it that workplaces, can and should be looking at doing. So, I mean, Emily, I'd be curious if you can kind of talk us through a little bit about some of your thinking that, went into that. And as we kind of reimagine, the world of work, how can we harness kind of these positive aspects while, avoiding things like, presenteeism, the proximity advantage and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. It was a great piece to write with a colleague of mine, and I think there are no easy answers here. I think we all know that it's been a great real life trial of hybrid work, but we know that there are going to be challenges, and I think Jodi spoke to it, even just trying to, what is the new normal as we come out of this. So yeah, when we wrote the piece, thinking about what can and organizations do, like what are some tangible action steps that they can take, and trying to, leverage the flexibility that we've been able to experience over the last number of years, but also, again, the presenteeism, this notion of, can we make sure that we leverage what we've learned, as Kiersten said, and not revert back to what's normal. So the things that we talked about with respect, and again, recognizing we're in a white collar organization where we work with professionals who are at their desk jobs. But we thought that we, as a leadership team, really when we come to evaluating our employees, we need to move away from presenteeism to actually, and management by control, to managing by results. So we have been highly productive as an organization over the last 2.5 years, and that's been done remotely. And so we need to be able to stop focusing on utilization and seeing people in the office, and actually just, if our people are producing and they're producing results, then we need to recognize those outcomes versus checking on how many hours they have been in the office. With respect to performance management as well, we need to ensure that women in particular have a opt-out process for promotions versus a self-nomination process. Because what we find historically is that women might not put themselves forward into new roles, to higher level management roles. So let's give them the opportunity to opt out versus self-nominate, because that comes more naturally to them. And I think also with respect to performance management, is what we've instituted at the firm has been really successful, is what we call a bias review. So when we do have our performance reviews and we get together to discuss people's performance, we have someone that sits in there as a bias challenger and actually says, are we being harder on this individual because they've chosen to work more flexibly, because they have children at home? And that's women and men alike. That's parental, being able to just have that flexibility. So really challenging the conversation when we go through performance management. That is absolutely something, large organization, small organization, that we can all put in place, I think, to help the conversation go forward.
No, great.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So why don't we kind of bring some others into the conversation for any reactions they have? So I don't know, maybe Kiersten, if you had any thoughts or comments on that.
Going back to something else you said about that empathetic advantage, I do think that's really, really important to bring out. If you look at one passion and interest of mine is kind of that the generational psychology thing is the shift that we're seeing with the talent that's coming into industry right now is I 100% agree with you. That would be a really big advantage. Taking that a bit further with the empathetic approach. So before I started Terra, I spent 20 years in the energy industry in a whole bunch of different leadership positions. And one of the things I always saw was when I looked at other leaders or looked at different organizations, there's people then project leaders, and there's project then people leaders. And I think to your point, whether we're talking about promotions, performance reviews, any of that kind of stuff, if leaders and organizations can start changing our mindset to people first, then project, it changes everything. It changes how we ask questions. You know, instead of walking into somebody's office and saying, where is this? You walk into their office and say, you know, how's your day going? How was your weekend? How are the kids doing? And I think I have this unlimited optimism that people are kind. And I think that if we can really understand each other's perspectives and understand each other's challenges, then we're way more likely to, to accommodate and to help where we can. So I always say that in all of this work and in EDI work in general, we can't lose sight of the people, the humans behind the challenges, because that's where we can all really connect and understand, I believe. Thanks, Mark.
Becca, over to you.
Sure. I really liked building on Emily's point, focusing on like outcomes rather than FaceTime. I think that's really powerful. And I also liked the point about bringing it into the room where decisions are being made. I think so often when we talk about biases and inclusion, we associate it with like an HR seminar. No disrespect to my HR colleagues here. But really, I think the important conversations are happening where those decisions are being made. To Kiersten's point, where you're designating that next project lead, for example, those are the meeting rooms, and virtual or not, where we need to have conversations about biases in the moment, rather than having that be something we do side of desk, and hoping that it permeates the decisions we're making. At Capital One, we have a similar system with performance management where we actually open every single session. And I mean that, like, if we have 2 sessions in the same day, we still open both sessions this way, where we talk about biases and we talk about specifically the types of biases that may be coming into the room. We use the phrase, Mark, in your question on proximity bias, and we would call it distance bias. But it's this feeling, for example, things that are closer to me are better. I'm sure no one will relate here, but my team's work is better than that person's work or that department's work. And really calling out that that's an inherent human bias, and we need to be talking about that in the room, in the moment, and trying to work against that human bias when we're making decisions about advancement or about performance ratings and things like that. Another example here is when we're designating people for roles, informally or formally, we try to start with a list. So rather than saying, who would be great to lead our monthly business review, or who would be great to step into this new project that we have that's really exciting, we recognize that we're biased. And if we go, based on who is top of mind, we're likely to pick people potentially who are more like us or who are more visible in some way. And in the new era, that could mean people we see day to day more often, for example. So one tactic we employ is starting with a list. Who are all the people who could be appropriate for that? And going through it together rather than going surely who's top of mind. I think the key here is recognizing that we're biased. I think if we go into it thinking, I'm not biased, I can make this selection off the cuff, that we're going to miss real opportunities to make differences in the workplace.
Yeah, and I think, Becca, that's a particularly salient point. I mean, there never really truly is a blank slate. We're all sort of coming at it with our own, thoughts, biases, institutional memory, good and bad, that'll sort of filter how we view things. So I think that's a really helpful point. Jody, over to you.
Yeah, I really like this conversation, and a lot of my work is focused on how do we embed all of these cultural and inclusion concepts into the talent processes. So some great examples there. And we do the same thing with inclusion moments, safety moments, psychological safety, and I would just amplify that what's good for everyone is good for women, and what's good for women is good for everyone. And so much of this is our focus at Suncor is on inclusion. So how do we create that great place to work for all? And it's not just the great place to work, it's the for all that I like to emphasize in this, because as we're having the conversations, we don't know, we're all guessing what this is going to look like. We are worrying about women not wanting to come in. I'm not sure we're seeing that yet. I walk around the halls and I see lots of women here, and I talk to people, and it's an equal issue for men, for women, for parents, for not parents, for people who have dogs, who they got through COVID, like all of these things. So I think that we are on the same track, Emily, Kiersten, what you were talking about around how do we really work towards this sense of flexibility, human connection, and conversations for what makes sense, and move less away from rules and structures and controls. And we're working through it. I think it's easy to say outcomes matter, but after years and years of expectations of being in the office, we are constantly working through that and learning.
No, great. Thanks for that. And so maybe Becca, we can sort of go back to you for this next question around the work that you've done to recruit, retain, and promote women in the workplace. And I know you talked a little bit about this already, for example, with project leader selection. But could you maybe say a little bit more about that and of the practices that your companies have implemented? Which ones have been most successful in your experience?
Sure. I hope I'm not solidifying my brand as being the data nerd here, but data is a really important part of the story for us. I think the more we can look at data on things like advancement, on pay, on role, the better informed we'll be on problem solving. We can slice pay equity data, for example, normalized for things like performance and tenure and education levels, or we can slice it without normalizing and look at the raw pay equity data across different groups, and those things tell us different things. So my strong plug here is to ensure that the organizations that you're working for are measuring these things so that we can be really focused on where we can employ additional resources to help problem solve. But I guess I think that should be table stakes. So maybe, Mark, that's not the most innovative, but it's it never surprises me to hear that even gathering the data can be a struggle for a bunch of folks. I think in terms of being innovative on the retention side, benefits is a space that is a great opportunity these days. I think a lot of companies have benefits programs that were developed 30 years ago and perhaps don't meet the needs of the modern worker. And even in a post-pandemic era, I would imagine needs are changing. One thing Capital One has done really well is focusing on all the different ways people start families. And as we think about our workforce and folks that are of that age group, that's a great opportunity for us to make a difference in terms of inclusion and helping retain people who may otherwise be looking, for better benefits elsewhere, or even to stop working for the sake of supporting their family versus being able to find that sense of inclusion, at Capital One. We changed our parental leave policy a few years ago, not only to use different language and not only call it maternity leave, but also to actually ensure our benefits were inclusive across our associates, regardless of whether they identified as a woman, for example. Our top up is actually offered the same for all parents, which is really exciting. And the data speaks for itself. In 2020, 31% of people who took parental leave were men. And this year to date, it's actually 43% men. and it's high performing men, it's new to the organization, et cetera. So it's really being broadly used. And I think that's fantastic, not only for our associates in keeping and retaining top talent, but also, of course, for their partners, if they have them that are at other organizations. We also offer, a lot of support for different ways to start families, like $15,000 towards fertility drugs, $5,000 towards adoption-related expenses. I won't read you a whole HR pamphlet here, but I think it's really important that our policies truly reflect the type of inclusive culture that we want to create. And, I could drone on and on about the ways that Capital One is doing this, but I think this is a really important way that we should look at our own cultures to see how much we're doing. It's easy to have a business resort group or, a women's network that shows up once a year on International Women's Day. And that's important, but really the policies that permeate our organization's culture, whether that's our benefits, whether it's the items Emily mentioned about talking about biases in the room during performance management, I think those are the things that are really going to be making a difference here. Okay,
great. Maybe Kiersten, we can go to you for a sort of reaction on this one.
Absolutely, I love the focus on data. I'm going to pick up on that because I agree with you completely. The privilege I have is bouncing around a lot of different organizations and seeing how different organizations are doing it. So the one thing I would add, or to take that a little bit further, is we need to make sure we're actually looking at the data right. I think what I'm seeing so often is that we're doing these big enterprise level surveys and collecting this information, and then we're doing all these averages and stuff, which is essentially averaging out the experience of underrepresented or non-dominant groups in the organization. So one of the pieces of advice that I always have after we look at the data with leadership teams and organizations is to have a focus of not looking for comfort in that data, but actually searching for discomfort in that data. Because with respect to EDI and creating that inclusion, it's not about, you don't need a certain number of people before it's important. And the reality is that a few people in that survey data can actually help identify where some of the systemic and barriers are that could actually increase that underrepresented population. So that's what I would add, just to take that a bit further. But I love the I was very analytic and science in my past career, so I'm also a data nerd. So we're fast friends, Becca. Thank you.
Emily, over to you on this one next.
Yeah, I mean, the only things I'd add, again, I'm going to come to the data angle too, is KPIs. So you need to have goals, you need to have targets, and that has really helped us with respect to just representation, not only in our partnership group, but also within our employee group, and representation, not just by women, but what we call our priority groups. Because I think what is really important, and if I bring it back to women, is that you need to be able to see people in leadership roles who you align to. So what we're really clear about doing is again, having these representation goals at key levels of leadership so people can see it, they can believe in it, they can aspire to it. So I would that would be the only thing I would add, is a tangible action, is data does matter. And I think KPIs help drive results, especially when you link it to some form of compensation.
Great. No, thanks for that. So, Kiersten, I'm going to go to you with another question now, and it's about authenticity, which I know a lot of people pay lip service to. It's easy to say we want people to be authentic, but oftentimes it's really, we want you to be a certain type of authentic, if I can put it in those terms. And so, with the whole conversation around being able to bring yourself to work, I mean, there's lots of these types of dialogues that are going on. But in your experience, how can businesses best promote a culture that particularly enables women to be able to bring their whole selves to work in a variety of circumstances?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I've been thinking about this one for a few days, thinking of how to answer it. I think the only way that I can share some perspective is maybe just to get a bit personal. So I worked in the energy industry for 15 years before I went through gender transitions. I did that as a leader in the energy world, and I was saying all of that time I was so kind of looking inward and thinking I had this big barrier to be authentic at work, and nobody else has to deal with this, and everybody else can just do what they want and be who they want. And I always share with people, genuinely, the hardest part of going through transition in the workplace was learning how wrong I was, because that when I went through transition, it really opened this, and obviously it takes a lot of vulnerability to do that. And that vulnerability opened this door of vulnerability with so many people that were on my team or that I worked with. And people started sharing kind of all of the barriers and the challenges and the things that they were up against in the workplace. So it was a huge reality check. I always say is as much as I thought I understood, I did not have a clue. And that moment and that realization, without a doubt, is what pushed me into doing what I'm doing today. Is I want a different world for my daughter. I want a different world for just underrepresented, non-dominant populations in general. So what can organizations do? I love how you frame that, Mark. It has to be more than lip service. And one of the things that I learned doing my master's in psychology was this whole, and the way I frame most of how I do this work is a little bit going to Becca's point, is we need to understand the challenge. We need to understand where the barriers are, what's actually holding people back. There was a study that came out last month from JobSage that showed that 65% of employees are hiding something about themselves at work every day. And obviously the downside to that is it impacts, I can say personally, it impacts cognitive capacity, impacts just your morale, your happiness, your creativity. All of those things are suppressed when you're having to hold on to something or protect something at work. So when I was doing my master's, I learned what I thought was really a cliche thing, or until I learned about it, I thought it was a cliche thing, was this idea of hope. And I thought that was just something we said to each other, but there's quite a bit of science behind hope, with respect to, the agency and pathway are kind of the two things that make up hope or control hope. And so I think that's where organizations come in. I think if we think about agency, we need to be showing and demonstrating that it is possible. And we've heard that lots this morning. So that's where representation's coming. That's where mentorship and role models and all those things are coming. I have to be able to see that I can get there and believe that I can get there. And that's where we're kind of digging into all of the work really can add value. And then the second piece is pathway. And that's really where I go to that's the organizational enablement piece. That's making sure those systemic barriers are broken down. In the work that we do, it's certainly, to Becca's point, very, very data centered and data focused to make sure we understand. But one piece that we also do that I would always recommend is we look at policies, we look at all the systems and the processes and all that stuff, but then we always invest the time in doing one-on-one interviews with people and actually learning people's experiences. And I can tell you that it, without fail, will give you different perspective than a survey or than policy or any of that kind of work does. So I think what the role organizations can play is just starting to empower the work and empower the conversations. I'm a huge fan of storytelling, going back to don't lose the human behind the challenge. There's, again, tons of science why storytelling is so impactful, but it's really a great tool to get engagement. And then once you get engagement, you have to, and we have to start going through piece by piece and making sure that the pathway is there for women and other underrepresented groups to succeed in organizations.
Well, and I think, Kiersten, I mean, that point around, if I can call it the qualitative side of data is absolutely critical, because it's easy to do a survey and say, well, it's a 60-40 split in the office, but, therefore the majority wins. But actually, why is that 40% feeling the way they do?
Right.
And there's a lot of perspectives that you can unpack in a qualitative interview that you won't necessarily pick up in the macro survey data.
Right.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in just one audience question before we go, and that's around having sort of this issue about, we kind of talked a little bit already, but that's about women who particularly choose to work from home and ensuring that they're not passed over for promotions versus those who do decide to go into the office. And this is something that again, we talked a bit about the elder care piece, we talked about the child care piece, and also too, I mean, an ongoing conversation about, putting more women into either leadership roles, whether it's in management or on, boards of directors. And so given sort of the confluence, I feel like this is a good question to kind of wrap up the discussion on. Given all of that, and this being, again, a Women in Business Summit, how do we make sure that the women who work from home are not being passed over for these opportunities? So we'll do a quick sort of round through the panel before we wrap up. And so maybe, Becca, we can start with you.
Oh, goodness. Okay. I think there's an onus on both sides, which is, I think as leaders at organizations, it is absolutely our job to ensure that distance and location is not a factor in the way we make decisions about advancement, about roles, et cetera. And, as Emily and I both talked about, I think ensuring that you have, whether it's that bias interrupter or that slate of ground rules, predetermined criteria as we're making decisions, to ensure that that bias isn't permeating into our decision making. Focusing on outputs was another thing we talked about today that I think is extremely helpful there. And then I hope it's not controversial to say, but I think there's an onus on us as women as well. And I put myself in this category as someone who values that flexibility and appreciate that Capital One gives me the opportunity to work from where I work best, which means a mix of being in the office, being at home, or elsewhere. I think there's still some onus on me as an individual associate, not necessarily just as a leader, to maintain those connections. We know that things like mentorship and sponsorship are vital to the advancement of women. And we have to ensure that we're not only leveraging those in-person connections to create our sense of community at work. It might be a bit more awkward. It might mean a little bit more of a push to do something a bit uncomfortable, like reach out to someone within the organization who you've looked up to, who you think could be helpful as a coach or guide or mentor for you. But I think we need to ensure we're creating those connections, we're reaching out, we're staying connected to the organization regardless of location. And the good news is, I totally believe that it is possible to do that.
Great. Emily.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the same. I think that it is a two-way street here. And I think as leaders, I'm a mom of 3 kids, and I have really leveraged the benefits of flexible work. And I talk about it. I advocate for it. I'm an ally to those who want to do it. And I do really think that it is incumbent upon us as leaders to demonstrate it can be done effectively. I think the second piece on that, so allyship and being an advocate is one, but I also think that we need to pay it forward. So I'm in my position because I had a number of incredible mentors and sponsors, and they took time, and I learned to build those relationships in person. So there are things that you need to do to be in person to build relationships. And so again, I need to help other women come into the office to help build their networks, to help sponsor them and do things in person, because there are times where we do need to be in person, but it doesn't have to be all the time. And so it's helping them to learn that and to role model it myself.
Kiersten.
Great, and same with me. I agree with everything that is said. The one piece to take a little bit further or to comment on is just, I love the conversation around outcomes. Is focus on that versus kind of how folks are getting there. Because I think what happens so often is with leadership or organization is what I would call like fortune telling. We assume that because somebody's not in the office, it's going to impact their deliverable or what we're trying to get from them. And I think the challenge is just to flip it on its head and say, deal with the problems as they come out, but don't assume that there's going to be a bunch of challenges just because folks are working from home. The other thing, as I shared earlier, is just that it's flipping it around and people first. I think if we just check in on people first and blur those lines. I love the conversation earlier this morning about the work-life balance is not, I think blurring the lines between work-life balance is really important, and we should elevate the importance of that the same as we do as checking in on project progress or all those sorts of things. And that connection, I think, will drive comfort and authenticity.
Jody, last word over to you.
Sure. I really just will echo what everybody else has said. It's so important to talk about it. Just talk about it, understand, listen, learn, And what Becca had said, it's the two-way street. I would even add it to be the third. I think all employees have an accountability to step in and figure out what's going to work and make the effort to demonstrate how it's working. I think as leaders, like you said, Emily, I think you need to step into that and make it okay and be a sponsor, pay it forward. And Kiersten, I think you're right. It's the company's responsibility to have the systems and processes and focus on outcomes and put things in place. So I think it's multifaceted, and it will result in better talent decisions overall and better business outcomes by having that empathy first, compassionate approach to people and considering all of these things.
Well, and I think too, just to sort of end off, I mean, even as someone who's obviously not a woman in the workforce, you know, if I think about, you know, at least in my career, the sponsors and the mentors that I've had, you know, I can fully attest to them being an absolutely critical part of people developing professionally. So just to say a ringing endorsement from my perspective, and I think especially even so in a women in the workforce context there. So with that, I just want to say thank you to Kiersten, Jodi, Emily, and Becca for making the time with us this morning / this afternoon. Really insightful discussion, and I think always a good sign when there's more questions in the Slido Q&A portion than we have time to get to for folks. So really sorry for those of you that asked questions that we weren't able to answer.